Hello everyone, and welcome to our ninth session for Sociology 111, Introduction to Sociology. This is, of course, the statewide synchronous sessions. My name is Matthew Howell. I'm located at the Valparaiso campus. You can contact me at mhowell1, that's MHOWELL1, at ivytech.edu. I hope everybody had a good break and enjoyed their time off. Today, first day back, beginning week 9, we will be covering chapters 12 on gender and chapter 13 on aging. So we're going to take a look at those two chapters today. Before we do start that, I would like to let everybody know that we will be continuing these sessions in the fall. I am not sure if we're going to be doing them in the summer as of yet. So I do not know if I will be recording these for the summer, but I believe we will be continuing this program in the fall. And so we will be expanding this program as well, trying to get these statewide synchronous sessions for more and more courses. Okay, so as I said, today we're looking at Chapter 12 and Chapter 13. Chapter 12, of course, is stratification by gender. Some of the issues we'll be looking at: the social construction of gender, sociological perspectives on gender. We'll talk about why women are often referred to as the oppressed majority. We'll take a look at women in the economy, in the workforce here in the United States of America. We'll talk about the emergence of a collective consciousness, looking at solidarity amongst women. Social policy, we'll be examining the battle over abortion from a global perspective. So, what are the questions we're going to be trying to answer? What are the accepted gender roles in today's society? Have men and women's positions in society changed? How do gender roles differ from one culture or subculture to another? All right, so when we say gender role, what we're referring to are expectations about norms. What are the norms of gendered behavior? What are our expectations regarding proper behavior, attitudes, and activities of males and females? The idea of being purely masculine or purely feminine exists as an abstract ideal. Most people display some combination. Most people do not display strictly masculine or strictly feminine qualities. Now, behavior is constructed socially, so people tend to reference what is appropriate masculine and appropriate feminine behavior, essentially using the ideas of the people around them as far as appropriate behavior. So this behavior is constructed socially. This is evident in work, how we react to others, and behavior. Essentially, gender roles exist in our society. We may have ideas about what is wrong with having gendered behavior, but that does not negate the fact that we have very strong expectations about proper gendered behavior in our society. And this is something we learn. We go through a socialization process, learning appropriate behavior. Masculine gendered behavior for boys includes being active, aggressive, tough, daring, and dominant. Feminine behavior for girls includes being soft, emotional, sweet, submissive. The way that this plays into, or homophobia plays into this, is interestingly enough, what's kind of referred to by a particular researcher, C.J. Pascoe. She has done research on what she refers to as appropriate gender role policing behavior amongst adolescents in high school, focusing specifically on masculinity and sexuality. One of the interesting things she found out was that boys in high school who exhibit inappropriate behavior are regulated by what C.J. Pascoe refers to as the fag discourse. Essentially, they're called fags for acting in gender inappropriate ways. One of the things that she did discover that was interesting was that in high school, amongst the group of people she was researching, high school boys, the accusation of fag simply meant that you were acting in a gender inappropriate way. It did not contain an element of sexual orientation. While most of us realize that fag is a derogatory term that carries an element of homophobia in it, prejudice against homosexuals, what C.J. Pascoe found in her work with adolescents in high school was that they weren't focusing on discounting somebody because they were gay, but because they exhibited inappropriate gender behavior. That's what the fag discourse truly referred to in her research. Whether or not the boys who were subjected to the fag discourse were actually gay was irrelevant. It was about the behavior, not about sexual orientation. Now, when we think about this idea of homophobia, we are a homophobic society. And the way that we get socialized into this homophobia is by adults, older siblings, mass media, religious institutions, and educational institutions, all of which exert important influence in socialization. Remember, we have the four main socializing agents: family, friends, schooling, and media. Now, in here we see religious institutions because they play a large part in shaping the discourse on same-sex relations at a national level in the United States of America. There are many who are opposed to it on a religious basis. However, when we think about learning this kind of thing, the first socializing agent normally is parents. So parents are the ones that are responsible for initial socialization and initial attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors amongst people. Okay, thinking about like the idea of gender roles, women's gender roles, look at the picture right here. Girl playing with a doll, feeding it. It's a surrogate infant. I mean, she's being socialized into the expectation that females will be the primary caregivers in the family. So we see this pervasiveness of traditional gender roles extends to education. We can go beyond just looking at pictures of what's going on. Even if we think about, like, the books we use to learn to read, like Dick and Jane. See Dick work. Dick says, I can help Daddy work. See Jane. Jane helps Mom. Jane says, I can help Mommy take care of the home. So we see gender roles even in some of the stuff we are using for educational purposes. And females have been much more restricted by gender roles, traditional gender roles, than males, as far as what they are free to do. Essentially, when we went through the Industrial Revolution, the private and public sphere within the family, within the home, got separated. Because the public sphere is the way a family connects economically to the society around them. The private sphere is where child rearing and child care takes place. In colonial families, the public and private sphere were both centered in the home. And both parents participated in those roles. Both parents, in fact, the entire family in an agrarian society participates in the economic production, in the public sphere. Because when you're part of a farming family, everybody works. As we saw this change and the economic center of the home moved out of the home and into the factories, only one parent was permitted to follow those jobs into the factories and in what we would call the public sphere, and this was the males. Females then became restricted to the private sphere of taking care of the home and the family. So traditional gender roles have restricted females more than males. When we look at the idea of what it means men's gender roles, There have been changes in attitudes towards parenting. When it says little change in traditional male gender role, what that means is the majority of males are still focused very much on the instrumental task rather than the expressive task within the family unit. That is, the man is the one responsible for earning money and taking care of instrumental tasks like providing money for all the costs associated with a home. Women are more responsible for what is referred to as the expressive role. So we see attitudes towards parenting changing as far as how we think that children are effectively brought up and socialized, but we're seeing little change in traditional male gender role, although stay-at-home fathers are becoming increasingly common in our society, increasingly prevalent in our society. However, there is this idea that men need to be logical, calculating, rational, and reserved emotionally. So boys who adapt to cultural standards of masculinity may grow up to be inexpressive men who have difficulty or simply can't share their feelings. Now, that's the kind of traditional cultural standards of masculinity. It is becoming more acceptable, more common for men to have variety in gender roles that are acceptable for them to display. If we think about these ideas of gender role distinctions and the labels that derive from them, which are independent and do not overlap, what kinds of things do we think about here? It's kind of something that's interesting to think about when we talk about gender. So when we think about this idea, the labels of them, like the fag discourse, they derive from very definite gender role distinctions which are independent and do not overlap. Separating gender from sex is impossible, yet we cannot just simply say that males equate to stereotypically masculine expressions or females with stereotypically feminine expressions of gender. Increasingly, the idea, like we see bromance and metrosexual, these are the ideas that men should be more comfortable accepting traditional feminine role behaviors. They have changed to become more ambiguous. Margaret Mead was an anthropologist who took a look at highly diversified constructions of gender in her research on the tribal societies of New Guinea. But anthropologists have done a lot of this. When we look at the idea of gender stratification, first of all, it requires individual socialization into traditional gender roles within the family, where men are responsible for the instrumental tasks and women are responsible for the expressive tasks. So people have to be socialized by their society into those traditional gender roles. And these gender roles have to be promoted and supported by other institutions, say religion and politics. If we look at U.S. society, we can see that within religion and within politics, there are certain groups that promote the traditional roles and support the traditional roles. Religion, conservative religious groups, most definitely support traditional roles. Conservative politicians tend to promote and support traditional roles by other social institutions, providing, making it easier for single mothers to get assistance, Medicaid for children, single mothers living in poverty, to get assistance, than single fathers is part of this gender stratification. But when we think about, traditional gender stratification, the man is the one who's the traditional breadwinner, and the woman is the one who is the traditional caregiver. This is actually a phenomenon that contributes to what is referred to as the feminization of poverty, because when a family unit breaks up, in general, the children go with the female parent in the case of a heterosexual household, and in general, the majority of the money goes with the male parent. So we do see some, like even in the system of our legal system, the system of jurisprudence, they are not really looking at taking into account where the majority of money needs to be distributed. Additionally, there are male rights groups that fight for father parental rights, because it is very easy for, and especially in very conservative states, it is very easy for women to gain custody and much harder for men to gain custody, other than visitation. Primary custody tends to be awarded to the female parent. So, when we look at this idea of sociological perspectives, the functionalist view considers stratification within the family unit, gendered stratification within the family unit, as beneficial for overall social stability, because the new members of society have both the expressive tasks taken care of and instrumental tasks taken care of. Instrumental tasks, as I said, are the tasks, it's an emphasis on accomplishing things. Providing money, providing shelter, providing clothing, providing food, providing resources that are needed. And this tends to be, in traditional kind of gender role behavior, the male is responsible for the instrumental tasks. Female is responsible for expressive tasks, which are maintenance of harmony and internal emotional affairs of the family. So, in traditional view, women are responsible for the emotional well-being, men are responsible for the physical well-being as far as providing resources. Women are still the primary caregivers if the child is sick, cleaning the child, stuff like that. So when we look at this, the dividing task between spouses actually made sure that children were taken care of very well. So the functionalist view actually says that stratification, gender stratification, is not necessarily a bad thing because it contributes to the overall social stability. Conflict response says the functionalist approach kind of ignores the underlying power relations between men and women. Relationship between females and males is traditionally one of unequal power. This may have been like kind of even, there were social scientists who may have attributed other problems that women suffered or attributed this power differential to other reasons. Think about like Freud's penis envy, for example. Is it really that women want to have a penis, or is it that women look at having a penis as the pass that gets you into the group that enjoys social power? So it's more, in my opinion, it's more about power than it is about actually sexual genitals, the genitals you have. It's about the relationship, the power relations. So gender differences are viewed through the conflict response as reflection of subjugation of one group by another. It's not just that it benefits society overall, it's that it also benefits men more than it benefits women. Women are the subjugated group, providing free labor in traditional family units, and men benefit from this. And of course, the feminist perspective grows out of the conflict response to the functionalist approach. Friedrich Engels, who did a lot of work with Karl Marx, was also an early suffragist in England and believed that private property was where you began to see the subjugation of women. Because there are various reasons. One of the reasons was that only men could own property at certain periods of history. The overall exploitation and injustice inherent in capitalist societies is viewed by many contemporary, or is viewed as, the subordination of women is viewed by many theorists as part of the overall exploitation and injustice inherent in capitalist societies. So, The idea of the matrix of domination, which is also known as intersection theory, is the idea that if you have more than one minority status, its effects become cumulative. So, for example, being female and black carries with it more obstacles, more disenfranchisement than being female and white, because somebody who's female and white only has the minority status of being female. Somebody who's female and black has both gender and racial minority status. So we need to consider gender in conjunction with other minority statuses and how this further disadvantages people. And the whole idea there is that race, class, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, there are all sorts of demographic factors when we think about how we kind of categorize people: race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, disability status. Intersection theory looks at all these minority statuses and essentially says the more of them you possess, the harder it is for you to achieve your goals in a particular society. Feminists do address the needs of minority women, but, for example, African American feminists say that race actually is a bigger factor in poor minority women than gender when you think about oppression. They are much more oppressed by race than by gender, by the racial characteristics than by the gendered characteristics. And then we get to the interactionist approach. Gender stratification is something that plays out at the micro level. We do gender by reinforcing traditional masculine and feminine actions. Anytime we look at somebody and we try to shame them for exhibiting inappropriate gendered behavior with maybe a joke or something like that, we're actually doing gender. We're reinforcing the traditional masculine and feminine actions. The interactionist approach also takes a look at the role of gender in cross-sex conversations where you have males and females talking to each other, or talking across each other, however you want to view that. Okay, sexism is the ideology that one sex is superior to the other. In the United States of America, sexism tends to play out as males being viewed as superior to females. And then, of course, we've got institutionalized sexism as a form of institutionalized discrimination. Remember the difference between individual discrimination and institutional discrimination. Institutional discrimination is where you have no overt discriminatory policies, like we don't have Jim Crow laws anymore, which would be overt discriminatory policies. However, we have a society that disadvantages minorities. So, we have no overtly discriminatory laws, yet the normal operations of our society result in discriminatory outcomes. That is institutional discrimination. U.S. society is run by male-dominated institutions, yet with this power comes responsibility and stress. Some researchers believe that having the power in society and being responsible for the instrumental tasks in the family gives men more social power. However, it also afflicts them with more chronic conditions, stress-related chronic conditions. Because as an empirical fact, it is true that women live an average of 5 years longer than men in our society. So, while we have inequality in our society, and while the Fair Pay Act has still not made it through Congress to be signed into law, the act guaranteeing equal pay for men and women, it continues to be opposed in Congress. Women have it better in our society than they do in other societies. In many nations, women are denied equal pay, sexually harassed at work, or dismissed from job because of pregnancy. None of that's legal here in the United States of America. Not saying it doesn't happen. But In other nations, it's actually legal behavior. It's illegal behavior in the United States of America. You cannot be dismissed because you're pregnant. You can file a lawsuit for sexual harassment, and you can also contact the Labor Board and the EEOC, and women still earn roughly 77 cents on the dollar for what every man earns in our economy. However, that is illegal as well, according to the 1968 Civil Rights Act amendment. But women do suffer from second-class status. However, as we've seen, women mobilize individually and collectively. In the United States of America, there have been three big waves of feminism. First one kind of started in the late 19th century. There were a lot of women involved with the temperance movement, then the suffragist movement, and then the equal rights movement. And so we've seen kind of these collective mobilizations of women that have achieved some of their goals. Women, as I said, continue to be the victims of unfair pay in U.S. society. However, compared to other nations, if you go and look in what they refer to as sweatshops, where workers are being exploited in developing nations, you'll find a lot of the labor being performed by women. And then when you talk about agriculture and stuff like that, you see that performed by women as well. In industrialized countries, while I say there's still inequality that exists in the economy, inequality really exists in the home. Even in households where both partners, man and woman, agree that they split the housework equally, women are responsible for doing about 60% of it. And overall in U.S. society, women do about 70% of the housework. It's what's referred to as the second shift. We'll get to that in a few seconds. When we talk about labor force participation, we can see that it continues to grow. Almost 60% of adult women in the labor force in 2009, a huge leap of close to 20% from 1970. However, women tend to be, there's gendered stratification in occupation. Women are underrepresented in occupations historically defined as men's job, business executive, CEO, banker, things like that, like executives, and other jobs too. Women tend to be underrepresented as doctors, mechanics. They tend to be overrepresented in fields where they're defined as women's jobs, restaurant servers, elementary school and kindergarten teachers, nurses, of course, and even where women may be working in a field where they may have been denied participation historically, they may run into what's referred to as the glass ceiling, which is that invisible barrier that blocks promotion of qualified individuals because of their group affiliation, whether it's gender, race, or ethnicity. In fact, I believe Walmart came under fire for this a number of years ago for not having enough female supervisors and managers and general managers when their workforce was overwhelmingly female. They had a lot more females as workers, but most of the supervisory positions were occupied by men. Compensation, of course, the gender gap exists. The average you hear is roughly 17 cents. Some people have it as high as 24 cents. The figure I quoted you was 23 cents. Other people manipulated to get it down to 4 or 6 cents. But it's the kind of thing that they're talking about the degree. The pay gap is wrong no matter how big it is. Here we have the figure of 80 cents. Male nurses, male grade school teachers, and male librarians will be put on what's called the glass escalator. This is where white males are fast-tracked into administrative and supervisory positions over the heads of qualified females and minorities. For example, the majority of elementary school teachers are women, but the majority of elementary school principals are men. So here we see playing out. Male nurses represent less than 5% of the total workforce, yet they're over 10%, and some people may say as high as 15% of the nursing supervisors in the nation. So they're overrepresented in supervisory positions. Women are expected to juggle work and family in a way that men aren't. In fact, women who choose to have a family sometimes may be put on what's referred to as the mommy track, which is a lower achieving track with regards to promotions in a company. Men are never asked to choose between work and family. Women often are. Women also deal overwhelmingly with the second shift. This is where women are working full-time in the economy, and then they come home and have a roughly 7 to 7.5 hour day of childcare and housework ahead of them, where they receive not a whole lot of help from the men. The greater amounts of time women put into caring for children and housework takes toll on them pursuing careers. As I said, often they will be asked, how do you feel about family, and do you want to have children? And if that happens, they'll be put on a lower achieving track. The expectation from companies is that women will be the ones taking time off if children are ill or out of school for whatever reason, and that women are the ones that are primarily responsible. So we still see this idea of kind of gender segregation or gender stratification. Really, in the economy, they're kind of buying into that traditional family role still. Okay. The emergence of a collective consciousness, this is where we saw, as I said, a group solidarity kind of emerge for women with the feminist movement. Feminism gets a bad rap in the media. There's all different kinds of feminism. There's moderate feminism, social feminism, radical feminism, militant feminism. About the only thing you ever hear talked about in the media, though, is radical or militant feminism. And it's the idea that women want to take society over. This is not the case for 90% of feminists. 90% of feminists are only advocating for social, economic, and political equality. As I said, the feminist movement was born in 1848. It became part of the temperance movement. And then into the suffragist movement, and then joined the civil rights movement to become the equal rights movement in the 1970s. Women generally believe that women should be equal in society. However, many of them do not like the label feminist, and as I said, a lot of that has to do with the negative connotations of that particular label in our society. Okay, abortion. Pro-life, pro-choice. This is kind of the way it's been phrased in our country. However, let's take a look at what goes on both in our country and around the world. Roe v. Wade, of course, was the landmark Supreme Court decision in 1973 that granted women the right to terminate pregnancies. Pro-choice groups believe women have the right to make decisions about their bodies. Pro-life groups believe that you're committing murder anytime you perform an abortion. They believe life begins at the moment of conception. More extreme groups among them believe that fetuses feel pain as soon as conception occurs. Most doctors believe that the reason you only have first trimester abortions is because the brain is then developed after that first trimester enough for the fetus to feel pain. And that's why late-term abortions are no longer performed in our society. Most scientific evidence, though, does not talk about thought and pain beginning at conception. Usually that's somewhere around 18, 19, 20 weeks in. So, the debate following Roe v. Wade revolves around prohibiting abortion. Most people in our society believe there should be some types of prohibitions on abortion. It shouldn't simply be used as birth control. Also, many people believe that if a person is underage, under the age of consent, sexual consent, parents need to be notified, and so consent, there's these issues as well. As I said, most people do not favor unrestricted access to abortion, but people in the U.S. overwhelmingly support having abortion with restrictions. Women who are the victims of incest, who are the victims of rape, women whose own lives are threatened, most people in U.S. society agree that these women should have abortion as an option available to them. The U.S. is not alone in this debate over abortion. So when we think about this, we think about, I mentioned something already about this, gender and social class defining issues surrounding abortion. Feminists tend to believe pregnancy and childbirth are socially constructed and male-centered. And so, you know, the whole idea of turning these things into kind of socially constructed events is about males and their offspring. Now, what happens when you eliminate organizations like Planned Parenthood is you don't eliminate abortion. All you do is eliminate legal abortion, and then we go back to what was happening in this country in the 40s and 50s, which was early 60s, which was a lot of 60s, which was a lot of back alley, or referred to as back alley abortions that are very dangerous, and many times mothers would die from that. Some activists have charged that family planning agencies and healthcare professionals are targeting young African American women for abortions. So when we think about policy, the Supreme Court continues to hear cases. Many nations in Europe liberalized abortion laws beginning in the 1970s, about the same time Roe v. Wade here in the United States of America. And then because of that, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, when Congress became very conservative, was kind of controlled by the GOP, Congress often blocked aid to countries that might use funds to encourage abortion. The thing here is, like I said, it's not, if you restrict access to abortion, you don't eliminate abortion. Restricting access to abortion just means that women are going to go get abortions in much more dangerous conditions. The way that you kind of eliminate abortion is you provide education, you provide contraception, and you provide social safety nets. And if young teenage women who are pregnant understand that they'll still be allowed to go to school and there'll be help from the government for them, then you'll see a reduction in abortions. And research has demonstrated these are the only tactics that really have an effect on reduction of abortion. It's not something that just making it illegal eliminates. So, okay, so that concludes chapter 12. Now we're going to be moving on to chapter 13, stratification by age. This will be a little bit quicker, but we'll take a look at aging in society, the sociological perspectives on aging, aging in a global perspective, and then kind of role transitions throughout the life course, and age stratification in the United States. Finally, we'll take a look at euthanasia. Some of the questions we're going to be addressing: how do people's roles change as they age? What are the social implications of the growing number of elderly in the U.S.? And how does ageism affect an older person's employment opportunities? So, moving on now. When we think about age stratification, the idea of it varies from culture to culture. One of the things you do tend to find is that the elderly tend to be respected as sources of wisdom in agrarian societies. When you get to industrial societies, that the elderly tend to be a little bit more kind of disenfranchised and viewed as not valuable to society. Kind of an interesting phenomenon. So when we think about this, though, when we talk about age stratification, what we're talking about is the creation of a structured hierarchy into which people are placed in categories. And, you know, if you think about it, we've got like infancy, toddler, early childhood, late childhood, early adolescence, early adulthood, middle age, and then young elderly and old elderly. There are actually two different phases. It's from like 60 to 75 are the young elderly, and then 75 and older are the older elderly in our society. So when we think about being old, remember master statuses. This is one of those master statuses that comes to be a definition of a person, part of their identity that's externally imposed. What is old? You ask people who are 60, they'll tell you old is older than 60. It's older than however old they are. But when we think about like the label, externally applied labels, once you're labeled as part of the elderly group, that becomes a master status. I'm getting closer and closer to that. This is the year I turned 50, so I just started receiving literature from the AARP in my mailbox. They're already trying to recruit me as a member. So I am getting to the point where there are people who are beginning to consider me as being old. And so this designation has a major impact not only on how others perceive people, but also how those people view themselves. If I accept that label of old, it will begin to change my behaviors. I mean, right now, my wife tells me I still act like a lot like a kid because I collect comic books. I like playing a lot of games and stuff like that, and I really don't act my age, I guess. So if I accept that designation of old because I'm 50 years old, well, now I'm old, that may change behaviors, and it may change how I view myself. Of course, that's coming a little bit out of that interactionist perspective, but we'll look at that in a little bit. So, properties of minority or subordinate groups do apply to older people in the U.S. In fact, there's legal discrimination against the elderly in the U.S. What do you think mandatory retirement is? It's legal discrimination. It's basically saying when you reach this age, you can't do the job anymore. We've all known people who seem much younger than their actual age or much older than their actual age. So it's a policy that's discriminatory because it ignores individual variation. So we see this unequal employment treatment, mandatory retirement. They share physical characteristics of a weakening of the skeletal structure and the muscles, slowing down. So physical characteristics. Membership is involuntary. In fact, this is the one minority group, barring tragic circumstances, nobody gets to avoid. Everybody in our society will become part of this minority group, as I said, barring tragic circumstances like early death. And it gets to the point where you can no longer refuse to accept the label of old or elderly or senior citizen. People will just automatically apply that to you. There's a strong sense of group solidarity. The AARP is a very powerful lobbying group because of the solidarity of its members. The members of the AARP tend to vote overwhelmingly as a block because they recognize that all their interests align with each other because they share this minority status of being old or elderly. Generally, you will find people married to others of a comparable age. The spring-fall romance a lot of times what keeps it from working out is differences in life experiences and differences in developmental stages. So what we find is that people tend to marry other people homogamously with regards to age, which means they tend to prefer people who are roughly a similar age to them because they'll have shared references, shared experiences. Even if they grow up in different parts of the country, they will have certain shared references, cultural references. For example, people from my generation, Happy Days was a big thing when we were 10 years old or so. So most people who are in my age cohort are going to share that remembrance of Happy Days and remembrance of Saturday morning cartoons where kids would actually want to wake up first thing in the morning to run downstairs. And so this is why you find people generally married to others of a comparable age. So when we think about this, there are no clear-cut definitions of aging cycle. Old age typically begins between 60 and 65, and as I said, but you have young old age, young old, and old old. Here we see people in their 60s as the young old, and then people over like 75, that's where you begin to be referred to as the old old. Although we are seeing extensions in life expectancy. I just read an article in Time magazine. It's a speculative article, but it's speculating that children being born in the year 2015 may live to be over 140 years of age. So we are seeing what gets defined as old changes. If you've ever heard somebody say, well, 60 is the new 40 or 40 is the new 30, you know, these kind of things, or 40 is the new 20. What that means is that we're having quality of life that matches younger generations later in our life. At 60, we're every bit as active as people used to be at 40. You know, people 100 years ago, people who reached 60 were nowhere near as active as people who reached 60 are today. And so that's why we see this shift in what we call the periods of age and young old and old and how this changes. One of the fastest growing fields in the social sciences is gerontology, especially in psychology and sociology, because it's the scientific study with our population growing older and hospice care becoming more and more prevalent in our society, doing research on the specific psychological and sociological aspects of aging and problems of the aged is one of the fastest growing areas of social research. So, functionalist approach, getting back to our theoretical approaches here, and we'll have the functionalist, interactionist, and conflict. The functionalist and interactionist approach actually have named theories. Functionalist approach is disengagement theory. And what this says is that society and aging individuals mutually sever many of their relationships for the benefit of overall society and social stability. This helps people because it does not leave vacuums in society. As people grow older, death becomes closer and closer, so people need to begin withdrawing from social roles so that these social roles can be filled before they die. This is why we have retirement. This is, you know, why a lot of things we tend to see elderly people withdraw. From a functionalist perspective, it's for the benefit of society. And it's so there are no vacuums. However, disengaging completely from society leads to isolation. If you remember back to when we were discussing health, or no, we haven't discussed health yet. In the future, we'll discuss health. Social health is a part of a definition of health. So what we're seeing is a lot of people, once they retire, they actually may go out and find a part-time job. They may try to connect with communities. They may do volunteerism. I work at, or I volunteer at the Salvation Army I serve on the advisory board there, and a lot of the volunteers we see coming in to help out there are people who are in the latter half of their life. They tend to be what we would define as elderly. Interactionist approach is activity theory, and it basically says that elderly person who remain active and socially involved are better adjusted than people who completely withdraw. If you wrap yourself in a shawl and stay at home with your cats on the rocking chair, that's not going to be the best retirement. That's going to be a retirement that's actually socially unhealthy and may lead to other problems. Those who remain active and socially involved have better adjusted retirements. This can actually extend the life expectancy and lower mortality rates among certain cohorts. Pardon me. We are social creatures. We need social interaction. Without social interaction, we are not considered healthy. So older people have the same need for social interaction as any other group. We also need to feel like we're valued by society, like we're useful and productive members of society. This is why many retired persons will go out and find another job, a part-time job, because it gives them a sense of value, social value. So, labeling theory, which of course is a theory that we've seen when we looked at crime and deviance. It's this idea of it's not so much how old you are, it's how old society labels you. It's how society reacts to you. So society determines what old is. So it's more about how society labels you than and what that means for you as an individual. So old age should be defined in terms of how long one can be expected to live and how long one can actually expect to have quality of life as well. Old age should begin in the last 10 or 15 years of a person's expected life. That's why we have young, old, and old, because people are living. Think about Betty White, 92 years old. People are living longer and longer. So really, if we begin to look at 100 as the end of life as life expectancy, 85 is where people would become old then. Right now, of course, the average life expectancy is somewhere, around 75, and that's why old age begins around 60 in our society. I'm still 10 years away from it. I get to be middle-aged for another 10 years. But that doesn't stop the AARP from sending me stuff. If I was in a different culture, if I was living in Chad, I'd be old. In Chad, I believe the average life expectancy is 51. However, a lot of that has to do with higher infant mortality. It's not all about people dying when they're 51, but I would be considered old because 65 is about how long you can expect to live if you make it through the first 5 years of your life in Chad. If you don't suffer infant mortality, you can expect to live to be about 65. So, conflict approach. The elderly are devalued. Mandatory retirement is actually something that benefits the economy and benefits business owners, according to conflict theory, because it reduces competition for jobs. And it ensures that there are no vacuums left in the business world. So it benefits our society overall, but it disadvantages the elderly. The elderly are kind of disadvantaged and excluded from society for the benefit of other groups in society. Just becomes devalued. Treatment of older people in the U.S. reflects many divisions in society. If we think about this, like advertising, 18 to 49, that's generally where advertisers are targeting. So I'm getting past the point where I'm going to be targeted by advertisers. So we kind of have these transition from agricultural to industrialization, industrial economies, and from feudalism to capitalism is not always beneficial to the elderly. In agricultural societies, the elderly tend to be valued and tend to be taken care of. They are well springs of wisdom. In our society, that is no longer the case. Elderly tend to be disenfranchised. So when we think about role transition, These are general terms. It's not very specific. Like, we can't say that everybody at this age is in this stage of life. This kind of comes out of the work of Erik Erikson and his 8 stages of, or his 8 challenges, developmental challenges and developmental stages, where each stage has a challenge that an individual must successfully meet, or they become kind of stuck in that particular stage. And the most famous one was middle of life, and it's the challenge of leading a life or of accomplishing goals. And so when people reach the middle of their lives and they realize they have not achieved basic goals and ambitions and have less time, there's less time left in front of you than there is behind you, little time left to do so, this is when we see people kind of acting out in some stereotypical ways that have led to stereotypes of the midlife crisis, like dyeing your hair, getting a new wardrobe, getting divorcing your spouse and getting what they call the trophy spouse. These are behaviors that we see from people who kind of realize that they're older than they want to be. And so what they're trying to do is turn the clock back so that they don't seem like they have not achieved these basic goals at the point when they should. Okay, the sandwich generation. As part of aging, this is another phenomenon that's growing in our society. This is adults who have their parents and their children living with them, and they're taking care of both children and parents, trying to meet all these needs. And of course, you can see why they call them the sandwich generation. The caretakers are sandwiched in between 2 generations or 3 generations that need care. Of course, again, we see this division of labor within the household. Women, because caring is disproportionately done by women in the household, caring for aging parents disproportionately falls on women. Okay, so the last major transition occurs after age 60. This is where we see like retirement. Erikson calls it the end-of-life challenge, the challenge of having lived a life of meaning. So this can cause dramatic changes in people's everyday lives. Once you retire, there's kind of a period where you expect, I'm going to spend like 8 hours every day with my grandkids. Unfortunately, by the time grandparents get to retirement age, the kids are grown up and are starting to live their own lives. So you have to adjust to retirement. It's a rite of passage. Remember, a rite of passage is where we mark a critical transition from one phase of a person's life to another. Pre-retirement, this is the period where the person is kind of planning out, wow, I'm going to travel, I'm going to do all this stuff, I'm going to have so much free time, I'm finally going to read all those books I want to read, I'm going to spend so much time with my grandkids, getting to know them because I've been so busy working. And so you're making plans, and then you get to the near phase where you start to put these plans into kind of operation. And then there's the honeymoon phase. Boy, it's great being retired. I'm just going to sleep in until 4 o'clock every day. The disenchantment phase. This is where grandparents start to figure out that things aren't going to, or people start to figure out that things aren't going to be exactly as they want them in their retirement. In the case of grandparents, like I said, your grandkids are in high school or maybe even, beyond that now. They've got their own thing going on. And so they're not going to have the time that you want them to have to spend with you. You're not traveling as much. So you have to kind of go through a reorientation. And this reorientation is where you sit down and you think, okay, well, it was ridiculous of me to think that my 16-year-old granddaughter was going to have 10 hours a day to spend with her grandparents. That's kind of ridiculous. So you set more realistic goals. And then you just kind of settle into a stable pattern of behavior in retirement up until the point where you die, and that's the termination phase. You may go into hospice, getting ready, all this kind of stuff. So naturally occurring retirement communities, or NORCs, not NARCs, NORCs, these are where areas have kind of been taken over by retirees. So areas where many older Americans congregate. And then these kind of become informal centers for senior citizens. I remember this kind of happened at the food court in Tucson, Arizona, in a mall in Tucson, Arizona. And the reason this kind of happened was Tucson is a big retirement place for senior citizens. A lot of people like to retire down in Tucson because it's got nice weather. There were a lot of these retirement communities and homes around this particular mall in Tucson, and during the summer it became it's too hot outside, and my grandfather told me when he retired to Tucson in the summertime he would have to walk inside the mall, and he would go in and do exercise in the mall, walking laps in there. And he told me, and you started seeing other people doing this, and then eventually, after the exercise they would all congregate in the food court. And because there were so many elderly people congregating in the food court, other people started kind of staying away from it. However, when we think about it, kind of like community, it's an area where maybe all the kids have grown up. Everybody moved in there when it was a new development, and now everybody just stayed and is retired together. However, gentrification, which is the process of urban reclamation of blighted areas, can threaten the residents of these communities because many of them are living on a fixed income. So, Kugler and Ross research encouraged open discussions of the process of dying. There's this idea of 5 stages that you go through in dying. And she kind of challenged that a little bit and said this may not be entirely true. So, when we think about this, here's where we get this idea of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Those are the 5 stages of dying. This has been challenged because not everybody goes through these 5 stages. So what we're looking at is kind of, as a society, we do not like conversations about death and dying. The United States of America, we're not a society that wants to believe in that. I mean, if you think about it, we're even against euthanasia or assisted suicide. Okay, from the functionalist perspective, dying provides or fulfills social functions. It's created an industry, hospice care, but beyond that, it makes room for new members of society. So there's social functions that are filled by that. But hospice care is the idea of trying to make somebody's last days like they were at home instead of in an antiseptic sterile hospital. A lot of people have broken through these taboos we have in our society about death and want to discuss more openly the idea that people should have the right to choose to end their life from chronic pain, from other reasons. We're still not, just because they want to isn't a reason, and suicide as an act is still illegal in U.S. society, and that's what the whole thing with Dr. Jack Kevorkian was that he was assisting people in committing suicide. And we as a society don't like that. Think about what happened with Terry Schiavo in Florida. So, the graying of America. Right now, our population is approximately, I want to say 35 years of age. By 2025, it will be 41 years of age. And so we're seeing an increasing proportion of U.S. population composed of older people. And at the same time, the oldest old will grow at a faster rate as we extend life expectancy out. So we'll see that happening too. Women will outnumber men by a ratio of 3 to 2, and elderly are more likely to be white because of the better health outcomes for white people. You find Florida, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Iowa, West Virginia, and Arkansas have the highest proportions of older people, not old people, but older people. Typically, a typical older person has higher standards of living now than in the nation's past. If you think about it, many retired people own their homes and can actually draw the wealth back out of that. Private pensions and financial assets, and then the Social Security plan, which is socialized retirement funds for, it's essentially just a retirement fund that's controlled by the government. Poverty tends to kind of follow through. So if you were poor, as a child and as an adult, you're more likely to be poor in old age. Discrimination. Ageism was a term coined by Robert Butler, the physician, which is prejudice and discrimination based on a person's age. So ageism, as it gets practiced in the U.S., is discrimination against the elderly, prejudice and discrimination against the elderly. For many people, they view old age almost like they view disease. They don't want to be around the elderly. They feel like they can catch old age. Older people are barely visible on television. I mean, if you think about it, a TV show like The Golden Girls, running for as long as it did, is kind of the exception that proves the rule, because it was a show about four women living in retirement, and people kind of single that show out as something. There's not much else out there talking about that. But people who are happy with growing older and have positive perceptions of aging, this can actually benefit you because you can add roughly 7.5 years to your life. Older workers face discrimination in the labor force. The Federal Age Discrimination and Employment Act, which went into effect in 1986, essentially says that you cannot discriminate against somebody over the age of 40 for hiring purposes, and you cannot ask them about their age. You can only ask people if they are under 18 or 18 and over, and it's because of this particular act. And courts have made significant decisions in favor of older workers, as far as making sure that they're not being discriminated against. So, again, talked about gender, emergence of a collective consciousness. The elderly, AARP, which used to stand for the American Association of Retired Persons, is an organization, an advocacy organization that has devoted itself to creating this collective consciousness amongst the elderly. And as a lobbying group, it has demonstrated the political power of the elderly. But this idea of a collective consciousness is an awareness of the social power that elderly possess. Talked about AARP. They have a national committee to preserve Social Security and Medicare. If you want to commit political suicide in this country, all you got to do is talk about privatizing Social Security and Medicare. Every politician who has made these kind of plans has faced consequences because of it. And a lot of that has to do with the AARP. Senior action in a gay environment. This kind of looks at formation of organizations for elderly homosexuals, because these are people who may have been gay their entire life, but were always afraid to come out because of the incredible level of stigmatization and prejudice and discrimination. So now there are advocacy groups trying to get people who are homosexual but elderly in order to advocate for their interests and their issues. Now, the problem with the way that we look at a lot of topics in this is that we tend to kind of view it all like when we talk about the elderly, I'm talking about everybody over a certain age in the U.S. The problem, like I said, with that is that there's diversity and there's overlap. Elderly racial minorities are going to have more obstacles than elderly white people. So we're going to, and elderly, as people become disabled from growing old, that puts them into a different kind of group because they have something in common with the disability movement and not just specifically the elderly movement. So they are a diverse group, just like with gender, you're talking about a diverse group. And even when we talk about race and ethnicity, we're talking about large groups of people where there is diversity. So, okay, euthanasia or assisted suicide. Physician-assisted suicide, the debate over Dr. Jack Kevorkian, was one aspect of a larger debate in the U.S. over the idea of euthanasia, which is allowing somebody to choose to die because of chronic pain that cannot be cured. Some people feel like this is still a sin because of a religious foundation. People, Christianity views suicide as a sin. And we tend to value human life very strongly. So there's a lot of division on this particular issue. Dr. Jack Kevorkian did go to jail. Euthanasia is illegal in U.S. society. It is a form of suicide. Now, the difference between active and passive euthanasia is active euthanasia is when you have like a suicide machine and somebody actually presses the plungers down to inject themselves with drugs. And passive euthanasia is when you just take them off life support. And that is what was going on with Terry Schiavo in Florida. So you see there's still opposition to it, but there is greater legal tolerance for passive euthanasia, especially when you consider what are called DNRs, or do not resuscitate orders in hospitals, because that is kind of a form of passive euthanasia as well. So when we think about this, in the past there were societies that practiced what's referred to as senilicide, killing of the aged. The American Hospital Association estimates that there's a lot of passive and active euthanasia going on as far as quietly negotiating the right to die. And so what does that tell us about our society? First of all, the people who are going to be able to get this done are going to be people who have more access to health care. So they're more likely to be privileged socially, economically, and educationally. Euthanasia is only legal in Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland in high-income industrialized nations. Oregon allows it. However, federally it's illegal. And, we're more committed to medical and technological advances allowing us to prolong lives. The thing about that is it doesn't ever address the moral, ethical, and legal questions and political questions of prolonging life. There was a South Park episode where they did this. They brought Kenny back to life after he'd been dead for a day. He was a vegetable, but technically the doctor said he was alive. Is that being alive? And with advances in medical technology, I know I gave you a ridiculous example there using South Park, but with advances in medical technology, these are going to be issues that are going to have to be considered more and more frequently. Okay, this concludes our discussion of chapters 12 and 13. Next week, we will move on. If you have any questions, you can contact me at mhowell1, that's MHOWELL1, at ivytech.edu. Have a good week, and I'll see you